I'm Joni Wadkey, co-founder of Academy LGBTQ and former PFLAG national board member. I am a mom along with my other duties, and I have 3 kiddos. My oldest is straight and cisgender. My middle kiddo is a trans girl. She's 20. And my youngest son is 16 and he identifies as gay. So I have found a lot of support with PFLAG National, along with a lot of other groups and resources that hopefully we'll be able to get into a little bit today. I'm joined in Washington, D.C. by Sean Connors, who is with PFLAG National. So Sean, if you could tell us a little bit about yourself.
My name is Sean Connors. My pronouns are he, him, his, and I am the chapter engagement coordinator for the Northern region at PFLAG National. I'm a transgender man. I have professional education in social work and a master's in education with a focus in social justice education and nonprofit administration.
Okay. And how long have you been with PFLAG National?
14 months. So I love it. It's like a dream job.
Great. It is. Yeah. It's like family. It is absolutely a family there. We're also joined in Chicago by Dr. Rob Garofalo, and he is with the Lurie Children's Hospital there. So Rob, Dr. Rob, if you could tell us a little bit about yourself.
Hi, it's a pleasure to be here. My name is Rob Garofalo, and I'm a pediatrician, and I'm the division head of adolescent medicine at Lurie Children's Hospital and the founder of our hospital's, or co-founder of our hospital's gender and sex development program. I'm also the editor-in-chief of the journal Transgender Health, which is the first academic journal dedicated exclusively to the health and well-being of gender nonconforming and transgender populations and communities.
Well, it's great to have you both here, and I love that you represent different facets of a child's transition, both which are critically necessary for both a child in transition and their families. So, Sean, what is, in terms of your role with PFLAG National, what have you been seeing in terms of transgender issues as they present themselves in the 400 plus chapters that PFLAG has across the country?
Sure. So a lot of our chapters are really supporting primarily families of trans folks, whether they're children or adults. We're seeing this huge shift right now in our chapters to supporting transgender parents of transgender youth. And so where we're looking to build community, a lot of folks are asking about schools and medical transition and how they can support their kiddo, which I think is really cool. Like, as a trans person who didn't get to transition until I didn't start hormones until I was 30, to see all these parents like supporting their kiddos in such a great way, and they really want to show up as allies, is huge. And it's really fun to be able to be a part of it.
It is, like I said, a family. And the other, I think, great thing that PFLAG offers across the country is that our motto really is to meet you where you are. So although there are lots of super affirming and advocating parents, there are also parents who show up every single month at PFLAG chapters around the country, show up at those meetings that are terrified and have no idea what it means for their kiddos and where they're supposed to go from here forward. And PFLAG is there for them too. And so I think that's really important that we talk about that it's really great to see the affirming and prideful parents that are celebrating their kiddos, but knowing that not everybody comes to the journey from the same place and not even within the same family. So you could have parents that are on opposite pages in terms of their level of acceptance or even celebration for their kiddos. And so I guess I would turn it now to Dr. Rob and ask you what you see in terms of your practice, in terms of your role, both as supporting that kiddo that may or may not be transitioning, but also finding support for the family so that the parents can fully appreciate their child's journey as well.
Yeah, so I'm glad you sort of led this off with a discussion of parents, because for me, and in addition to the young people that I see who are heroes, really the parents are really heroic in the way that they show up day in and day out for many of the young people that I see. I think in many ways in many of the civil rights challenges that we're dealing with transgender communities, the parents of these gender nonconforming children and transgender adolescents are going to end up proving to be some of the true heroes in these battles. And For me, when I think of my role as a pediatrician, it's, my job within the gender program is really not that distinct or different than my job in any other facet of being a pediatrician, right? Our job is to promote, the health and social well-being of these children in a way that validates them as their authentic selves. And so whether that's as a cisgender young person or a gender nonconforming or non-binary person or trans-identified person, it's really, using our skills and our multidisciplinary team at Lurie, and I'm really fortunate to have a crackerjack multidisciplinary team. But really, our job is to help promote, them growing up and developing skills as confident and authentic people.
Right. And then when you talk about that multidisciplinary team that you have, for folks that might be kind of new to this concept, what kind of professionals are involved in that team?
Yeah. So, in thanks in part to some generous philanthropy from our community, the Chawani Foundation, led by Jennifer Pritzker, really gave us an opportunity to do this work and do it well from the very beginning. So the Lurie Children's Program from the onset was able to have pediatricians, endocrinologists, social workers, psychologists, a psychiatrist. We have a medical ethicist as part of our team. And we also have people that are dedicated to do school-based work. I think one of the things that we didn't recognize when we started to do this work was that we could take excellent care of these children and perhaps their families within a medical context, but really where they were having challenges were on a school bus or within the classroom. And so I'll be honest, it wasn't a facet of our model that I thought of, right off the bat, but early on it became really apparent that in order to do this work well, we had to take a much more holistic approach of these young people's lives and see them within a much broader context of their sort of social development. And so school and school-based work has been really a critical component. And we also provide, support groups for young people and their parents. We do work with siblings. One of the things I think I'm most proud of the way we and many of the pediatric institutions that do this work across the country do it is we approach this from a family-based perspective, right? This is when I got on this call, it was about transitions, but there are transitions that are not only specific to the child or to the adolescent, but for family members, right? And for siblings and for parents that I think are really important to recognize and celebrate.
I couldn't agree more. And I know that as part of PFLAG National, Sean, you can probably talk about that in terms of the different facets that we're talking about that impact these families in terms of transition, we are dealing not just with the social transition or certainly that family or their extended family, which is a whole nother bag of worms, but also all of the other places that touch those families, and that is education. And then the other thing I think that we see a lot too, which I'd like you to speak to, Sean, is what happens in terms of transition in faith communities around the country. What are you seeing in terms of trends, in terms of faith communities being able to step up and celebrate these kiddos and their families?
That's a great question. I think it varies. It varies pretty widely, actually. In my experience, I can say that we're making great strides in particularly more traditionally conservative Christian communities right now. And I know recently there was a big push in Ohio to push some non-discrimination legislation through in a community that was centered around some conservative Jewish communities as well. So thinking about how people are getting into their communities and being advocates and trying to grow their own connections within those communities to meet people where they're at, like you said, and then to help people understand better, because really at the end of the day, I think a lot of folks just need to have a better understanding of what it means to be trans. And to Rob's point, even to bring in those community connections and realize that you're not just being trans is only one part of someone's life, right? So all these other aspects, if we're thinking about kiddos, school, or churches or religious life in general, community life, friendships, and all of these social connections, and how we figure out where we can just learn and grow as people, right? I think we're also still trying to learn how to engage in religious communities around this. I know that a lot of trans folks are sort of hesitant. If they transition, they don't have a good experience in their religious communities. I can say that was similar for me as a kid. They don't often go back, but being spiritual or religious is an important part of some people's lives. And so to be able to seize that piece of yourself and show up fully in your life is important.
Right. And I think that's why it's really important for faith communities and those involved with faith communities is they are particularly focused on making sure that they're welcoming all folks in. If you are an affirming congregation, regardless of your faith denomination, to make sure that your messaging is clear, so that folks who are looking for a spiritual home know where they can go. Because what we found is really that in any denomination, there's an affirming sect in it, and that you can find support without leaving your faith. And I think that's a common issue for kiddos, but particularly for their families, is thinking that they have to choose between supporting their child and their faith community. And what we have found at PFLAG in particular is that that's not the case, is that you can usually find the same or a very similar faith community that can support and celebrate you. So I think at this point, let's shift a little bit to the actual transition conversation. And I think to make sure that we're all on the same page, I think it's important, Dr. Rob, for you to talk about the kinds of transitions that folks have and the distinction between a medical transition that you might have in adolescence and adulthood that you would not have if you were transitioning, say, as a 5, 6, 7-year-old. And I think that's an important distinction that we need to make for folks. Can you talk about that issue?
Yeah, sure. How much time do we have? I mean, the reality, first of all, I guess I want to start off by saying that one of the great joys of doing this work is that I really approach this from a health disparities perspective, which is, as an adolescent medicine doc, I was seeing older transgender adults, who were, too many of them were homeless or at risk of depression or acquiring HIV. And I feel like my work with children is designed to hopefully avert, and change the health disparity, all too frequently affect too many transgender lives. But so the most important thing, I think, one of the most important misconceptions out there is that there are no medical interventions in a prepubertal child. I think a lot of we're not talking politics yet, but one of the political hot potatoes that I think often gets misconstrued is that we are intervening, medically, in the lives of children, and really the intervention that would occur, or the transition that would occur in a prepubertal child, is really about a reversible social transition, right? And again, it's to the construct that I was talking about earlier, which is, allowing a young person or allowing a child to just be their authentic selves and be happy and content with who they are, on any given day. There was, as part of the documentary, someone said something like, "I'd rather have a healthy son than a suicidal daughter," right? And so the transition, in many ways, I think, allows families, to make a decision for themselves and for their children, how they want their child to be raised in an affirming and supportive way. But I think it's important to recognize, sometimes parents come in and they'll ask me, well, should I socially transition my child? And I'll have to say, that's not a decision that I can make as a medical provider. I can tell you what we know about social transitioning and what we don't know. And I can tell you that it's reversible, and the main point of it is that you have to decide how to be most supportive and affirming to your child. It's not something that I think a doctor or a medical provider should be deciding. It's a family decision. However, once you reach, the age of puberty, which, in the US, if you're someone who's assigned female at birth, can be as young as 9 or 10, sometimes those individuals may begin to be undergoing an undesired puberty, right? And so there's nothing more traumatizing, to an adult. I mean, puberty is traumatizing for every adolescent.
Right.
Imagine having to go through.
We can all agree on that. That is
for
not
sure.
A
I'm a cisgender white man, and even I thought it was horrible. But I mean, could you imagine going through a puberty that is not consistent with, with your gender? That you were assigned sex at birth that does not align with your gender, and so the pubertal blockers, that we use in early puberty are also reversible agents. They're not permanent. And what they do is it's like hitting a pause button, right? And each child is different. For some children, that could give them and the family time to explore issues of gender and gender identity and what it means before a more permanent decision, perhaps around gender affirming hormones, may need to be made. For other children, it's truly buying time. I mean, they're pretty firm in their beliefs, but we don't start those agents, those medical interventions, until they reach Tanner 2, or the first stage that indicates that puberty is beginning. And by that time, the current thinking is that someone's gender identity at that point is relatively immutable, right? Like in children, we don't always know and can't necessarily predict who might persist or desist in any given gender identity. There's some fluidity there. But once a child reaches adolescent age, that begins to go through puberty, the belief is that that's much more permanent. It's a much more permanent construct. And so the pubertal blockers, again, are short term. You can't stay Peter Pan forever. It's, eventually, you're going to have to progress. And so, then at some point, someone will decide as part of the next portion of a transition to either use or not use gender affirming hormones. And that usually is estrogen in someone assigned male at birth, or testosterone in someone that's assigned female at birth. I'm oversimplifying things, but you get the drift. And then, so
yes,
those
thank
aspects.
You. For the sake of time, we'll assume that it's a linear path as well.
Right. And, and the one piece that I didn't talk about is there are also elements of surgical transition, which is a much more permanent, thing, obviously. And I think that's a much more complicated subject. But I think even for some young people now, surgical options are things that they're pursuing, again, in a pursuit to just align their bodies with their authentic selves.
Right. To make your body match your mind, because we haven't figured out how to get in and change your mind, but we can change the outside to match the inside. And I think it's also important for us to note on this panel too, when we talk about non-binary identities and gender fluid identities, that there are lots of folks that have no intervention medically and never do that. And that doesn't make them any less trans, doesn't make them any less authentic, that their lived experience, just their needs for their lived experience are different. And so as diverse as the trans population is, so are their needs and expectations in terms of transitions, both socially and medically. So I think that's important.
I think it's also important to note that transition doesn't start with a prescription for hormones, right? When I'm talking with young people and their families, as much as sometimes these, especially adolescents, come in and they wanted their hormones yesterday, not just today, they're ready to to have their lived experience be authentic. I really sort of work with families and young people to really understand that the elements of transition start long before a prescription is ever given to them. And I think that's really important when, again, my job as a pediatrician is to create a healthy, whole human being. And I think sometimes there's an over-reliance on a prescription and medical therapies. The transition process is much deeper and more deeply rooted than that.
And just real quickly, because I don't want to belabor it too much, but that we need to be clear too that those blockers typically predate any cross hormone therapy. So that it's not as if you're jumping straight into blockers and cross hormone therapy on appointment one. That typically there is, I'm not saying that never, but I mean, typically there is a kind of a phase, and this also is probably dependent on their age when they come to you. So if somebody's coming to you at, 6, 7, or 8, then once they reach, the age of where they're starting puberty, those blockers might be in effect, but then there might be another pause on those blockers for a little bit before they go onto cross hormones. Granted, somebody who comes into you at 16 is probably going to want to do that in a much faster path. But I just wanted to make it clear that not all of those paths, particularly if you're talking about younger kiddos, happens all in one instant, one fell swoop.
It would never happen
like that. It's a process.
No, yeah, and it although it's not linear, it is somewhat linear, right? And it is based upon age and pubertal development. And those adolescents who are starting gender affirming hormones straight out are generally older adolescents that, may not have presented earlier for treatment or care. So, but the younger patients, again, social transitioning you could think of, and then, pubertal blockers, and then gender affirming hormones.
So I think the other thing that's important to talk about too is that I think a common misnomer among the public is this need or desire for particularly kiddos to wait to transition. One is, we want to make sure that they're really serious about it, and that this isn't just a child who, I guess I heard this a lot with my kiddo, was kind of like they wanted to be Superman for Halloween and wore the costume for 3 months afterwards. That's not what we're talking about here. I think that's really important too. Sean, do you have anything that you want to add to that?
I think one thing when Rob was talking about how transition isn't like hormones are not the end all be all, or medical transition is not the end all be all. I also sort of thought, even when you get that medical transition, that medical intervention, transition doesn't end there either. It's an ongoing process forever in development, as like people develop as just humans growing through their life cycle. And I just thought, wow, like I really did have this misconception when I was transitioning, like hormones are absolutely what I want, what I need. They're going to solve all the problems in my life. It's going to be great. Totally not the case. I still have to do a lot of personal work too.
Sure.
And just thinking about...
When we do a readiness assessment with young people, it's mostly about trying to, like, what do they think? What are their goals and objectives? What do they think is going to happen when they start hormones? And then how do we align that with what we know is a timeline? Because oftentimes there can be a mismatch, right? A young person or a family can come in and their thinking could be like, all I need to do is start, estrogen or testosterone, and everything in my life is going to magically get better. And for me, that's one of the biggest red flags, to like take a step back and really work with a young person or a family about, well, what are some realistic, goals and objectives about this process and about transition? Because it's not like flipping a switch. Things don't magically improve or get better. It's as Sean said, this is really like transition is a lifelong process, for these young people and their families. And again, on our team, however we can support that process in a way that is affirming is our goal.
Sure. And I think the other thing that's important when we talk about younger kiddos transitioning and that knee-jerk reaction of the public of wanting them to wait is, and maybe Sean, you can talk to this, having transitioned a little bit later. I always think the transition part itself is difficult. There's a lot of hurdles. There's a lot of medical intervention. Mental health is usually a part of it. And then you're dealing with, like I said, your family, your immediate family, which may contain a couple of parents not on the same page. It may or may not involve some siblings that may or may not be on the same page and have different needs and thoughts about it. It's going to involve a faith community. Typically, it's always going to involve some kind of an education system. And then we've got medical and mental health. So it's a daunting task. So I think it's particularly humorous when people talk about the fact that you're doing it because it's the easy way out.
Yeah.
When in fact, it's quite an undertaking. Yeah. Financially, emotionally, spiritually, everything. Mm-hmm. But that I think it's difficult for people on the outside to understand and appreciate that providing somebody an opportunity to transition younger is actually healthy. Oh. The asking them to wait is what's harmful if that's something that they truly do need. And they've had consultations with medical providers and mental health professionals to sort through everything else going on in their life. How important that is in terms of it doesn't get easier as you get older. Which is the misnomer that some of the public have. Can you talk to that, Sean, as being somebody who transitioned a little bit later?
Yeah, well, thinking about my transition experience and the transition experience that I see of younger people now, it's such a gift that they get to, first of all, many of them, if I'm thinking about transmasculine people, because you have access to hormone blockers and other sort of medical interventions before those like puberty, it's better to to avoid some surgical interventions, possibly, to be able to really be socially transitioning online with your peers. Because I know for me, I feel like I'm in my mid 30s now, and I feel like I'm sort of catching up with my peers. You know, I didn't have those, I didn't get to go to prom and like take my girlfriend at the time. I didn't have like the traditional experiences that we think of as coming of age, or as like really like societally accepted growth experiences that I think I could have had if I had access to medical transition.
Sure.
But I also think that there's this really cool, so the first time I went to a trans thing was the Philly Trans Health Conference in 2009. And
yes, I was there.
I was there.
No way. It was like the first time I had ever seen a trans person in person. And it feels weird to me to be able to be a trans person who is considered an elder, because I don't feel like I'm an older person, but like I was taught that you know, there were maybe 5 or 6 parents there with their kiddos, like little kiddos. And we were taught that you thank these parents for showing up for their kids, because their kids get to transition when we didn't have the opportunity to do that. And just like being able to see that it's happening now, as much as like I have my own struggles, but to be able to see that these kids get the opportunity that we didn't, it feels really great. And I credit their parents and their families a lot, and medical professionals and folks who show up in different ways that we just didn't have, you know, even 10 years ago, which isn't a whole lot in the span of time that you know, when we're thinking about a life cycle, right?
But Sean, as parents have you to thank, because you were the trailblazers that lived your authentic selves when the world wasn't quite ready. And you are the ones that make it possible for our kids to get to be themselves and earlier and thrive and not have to go through the wrong puberty. So it's a dual appreciation, I would say, most definitely. And I think, Rob, this kind of lends itself to the question of going through the wrong puberty and what you find or what you see with your patients in terms of not being able to unring some of those bells. What has hormone blockers and cross hormone therapy provided for kiddos in this generation, which is the first generation to have them available? What have you seen?
Yeah, I mean, still the evidence is somewhat anecdotal, right? Because the long-term studies, you know, for instance, funded by the NIH are really just beginning in the United States, right? But you know, the early evidence suggests that these, you know, early medical interventions, you know, really do save lives. Access to care in many ways for these families and young people's save lives. But you know, what the pubertal blockers do is they prevent, you know, what we call secondary sex characteristics of an undesired puberty to develop, right? In a sex-assigned male at birth person, an Adam's apple, or, you know, facial structure or muscles, or, you know, when we're talking about organs like a penis or, you know, testicles, you know, and someone who's assigned female at birth, we're talking about breast development. These are all things that are generally horribly unwanted by someone whose gender identity is not congruent with their sex assigned at birth. And so, you know, what a pubertal blocker does is it prevents, you know, the development of these unwanted secondary sex characteristics, and then allows at a much earlier point, you know, to the initiation of gender affirming hormones. And so someone can proceed much more along the lines of a trajectory of a puberty that's desired, not one that's undesired. So you're really preventing the development of bodily or secondary sex characteristics that are largely undesired or unwanted, to say the least, you know, by most of my clients, most of my patients.
Sure. And before we wrap up, I think it's really important that we not finish this conversation without touching at least on the differences in terms of disparity of health access and other issues that occur in the communities of color. And when we're talking about transitions, and this, we happen to have 3 white people on this panel today, that I think that we need to address the disparities there. And so, Dr. Rob, can you talk to what differences you've seen and what your experiences have been in your clinic?
Yeah, I mean, it's something that weighs heavily on me, actually. I came into this field through an HIV lens, right? I really was an adolescent HIV doc, and who I was really seeing was young people of color, unfortunately, far too often trans women from communities of color. And yet, if
Mm-hmm.
you look at almost every pediatric gender clinic that exists in the country, that's the demographic that these clinics are seeing the least of, right? We're seeing
Right.
many more transmasculine and people that are white, and not necessarily tapping into trans feminine or trans women or people of color. And so, even though I think these clinics, which, when we started ours, I think there was only 4 or 5 clinics in the country. Now at last count, I think there were well more than 50, which is amazing, in terms of access. But we still are falling short in, if we really believe what we've all been talking about, which is access to care and early medical treatment saves lives, then we're not caring for the very communities that we need to in order to prove that those things are actually happening. Because it's
Right.
really
That's
Black
what
trans
matters.
women or trans women of color that are really suffering from the greatest health disparities in this country. And so, as much as I'm an optimist, and as much as I would never minimize the importance of the work that I'm doing, I also recognize that these programs are largely falling short, and we still have a great deal of work to do to really reach those communities most at risk.
And I think it's also important to note, you kind of touched on it just in terms of the number. While going from 5 to 50 is fantastic and it kind of brings tears to my eyes as a parent, I also would be remiss if I didn't mention that 50 clinics do not reach all of the kiddos that we have in the country, and that there are huge variances in terms of access to care that people encounter in different areas of the country. And so it's really important that with telemedicine and things like that, I'm trying to look at that as kind of a silver lining to the COVID virus, is that's accessible to a few more people than it ever was before, both medically and mental health wise. And that's really important that we reach more communities. So for example, I live in Omaha, and we don't have any pediatric endocrinologists who will meet with trans kiddos. And, Omaha's a relatively large city. So if we don't have that here, I know that we don't have it in those smaller rural communities virtually anywhere in the country. And so as people would like to believe that there are only trans kiddos on the coast, that's simply not true.
Yeah, and
they are indeed born and live everywhere across the country. That's something that if you are a medical provider and this interests you in any way, or a mental health professional, that there is a real need in some of these smaller communities to have access to care.
Yeah,
and so hopefully that's something is your program developing anything about that to have a broader reach?
I mean, we have trained a number of programs to launch their own programs, but I do think, even though there are now 50 or more programs, their models are very different, right? And so it's one thing to maybe have a pediatric endocrinologist or an adolescent medicine doc that can prescribe pubertal blockers or hormones, but do they have mental health people on their staff that are adept at working with and managing these patients? And I, for one, think that our models of care for these young people need to move from just discussions about access to discussions of quality. And so I personally believe, as a pediatrician, that like behavioral health care, mental health care should be ingrained within a primary care approach for the care of these children and adolescents. I mean, as we talked about earlier, puberty is hard enough, let alone like going through a gender transition. And so for me, connection to a behavioral health or mental health provider in an ideal world, or really in a solid clinical care world, mental health or behavioral health care services should be grounded within our primary care approach to these people, to these young people.
And you're right. You touched on competent care, and I think that's another thing that's really important, is that it's not just somebody who hangs out a shingle and says, "Oh, I have a gay friend, so I'm going to treat trans kiddos."
And it
does require a little more specialty than that, and that that help is available. If it's an area that interests medical and mental health professionals, there are folks who are willing to take on kind of a mentorship role to make sure that happens. But you need to be careful. They have very unique needs, and they're very complex, and not every trans person, as we mentioned earlier, is exactly the same in terms of their needs and their family and all of the other dynamics that go into it.
And it's not as gatekeepers. I think a lot of people are afraid when they hear mental health provider that there's this gatekeeper approach, and that's not what I'm talking about at all. I just feel like there's a lot going on in adolescence, and there's a lot going on in gender transition. And so the more we can, as a medical community, talk about an integrated approach where behavioral and mental health care just is one other aspect of what we consider to be the highest quality of care. I think that's what transgender people deserve. And I'm hoping that, moving forward, those will be the types of models of care that are perpetuated.
Well, and the other thing I think that would be super helpful is if there was more LGBTQ curriculum in all of our medical schools. Yeah. It's been falling far short for far too long. And so hopefully that will become a mainstream part of medical school curriculum. It's absolutely necessary, and it's super lacking at this point, and people have to seek it out other places. And although that's awesome that it's available and that we have internet and Zoom calls and all of those things that technology have provided us that we didn't have decades ago, doesn't mean that we shouldn't be doing it at the more molecular level in the med schools to begin with.
For sure.
So that it isn't a new concept for folks once they graduate. And
I will say 10 years ago, this was a nascent field though, right? There weren't that many people doing this work in pediatric endocrinology or adolescent medicine. And now, I hate to use an overused term, but now this discipline's hot, right? Young people coming up through training in medical school that want to do adolescent medicine or want to do pediatric endocrinology, this is a hot area of medicine that I'm just, that gives me a great deal of hope for the future. And, and lately, at least in our program, we're training trans-identified healthcare providers as part of the healthcare workforce. And so I'm hopeful that the future is bright, not just for the medical community, but for the patients and families that access care through us.
Sure. And Sean, what have you experienced in terms of your feedback from PFLAG chapters in terms of their access to medical care during transition, medical and mental health care during transitions?
It varies. Like you mentioned, it's hard when you live in a rural area to access folks. I know many people drive far to have appointments. I know that was when I lived in rural New England. I drove an hour just to have a primary care appointment, and I still had to educate the providers when I went. So chapters are sharing resources with each other, though. They are really coming together to build communities and say, hey, I live in this area with not a lot of people around, but I'm able to tell my friends that I met at PFLAG that I met with this provider and they were great, or I met with this person and they didn't really know what they were talking about and we didn't feel comfortable.
Right.
But also being able to open their arms a little bit more. I know you talked a little bit about communities of color, Joni, and being able to build those pathways too, where they can be more supportive and open and welcoming. I think of Omaha and Latinx communities, and I think of Chicago and Black communities, and how we can really reach out as chapters and be welcoming and open to, the people that we really want to show up for. And those certainly are the folks who have the least access to things like transition-related care, or who experience the most health disparities, particularly Black trans women, of course.
And violence.
Yeah.
But for sure.
Violence.
Yeah.
If there's one epidemic amongst this community, it's definitely interpersonal violence.
Absolutely. So I want to thank both of you for being on the panel, and I know that judging from this conversation, we could all talk about it for days and would love to. But we're going to wrap it up for now, and thanks everyone for joining us and being with us, and hopefully you've learned a little bit more about transitions and how to celebrate trans folks.
Thank you.
I really appreciate being invited to be part of this.